This week in the security news, a powerful GPG collision attack. How can a collision attack be powerful? Like, it's not an actual... Anyway, it's in SHA-1. An unpatched flaw, if you hadn't known, in Citrix, NetScaler now has proof of concept exploits in the wild from at least 2 different sources. A lottery hacker gets 9 months for his 5 cut of the loot. Windows 10 has a security flaw so severe, the NSA disclosed it. And PayPal patches a high-severity password vulnerability and a whole lot more. Actually, this will be in the first segment. We're going to interview Ryan Speers and Jeff Spielberg from Riverloop Security, talk about embedded product security, left of ship. In our final segment, we will be airing it earlier than I had once announced, our Hacker Culture Roundtable, recorded from the Security Weekly Christmas Extravaganza show, with a boatload of hosts from the Security Weekly family, all talking about hacker culture. It's going to be awesome. All that and more on this episode of Paul's Security Weekly.
This is Security Weekly, for security professionals, by security professionals. Broadcasting live from G-Unit Studios in Rhode Island, it's the show where exploits run wild, packets aren't the only things getting sniffed, and the cocktails flow steady. It's Paul's Security Weekly. The question is simple. Have any of the systems on my network been compromised? The answer is harder than it should be. Enter AI Hunter. Active Countermeasures has automated and streamlined techniques used by the best pen testers and threat hunters in the industry to create AI Hunter, a network threat hunting solution that does the first pass of a hunt for you to identify systems that are most likely to be compromised and scores the results on a scale from 0 to 100. You can then research those systems in depth with AI Hunter. Focus your valuable time on the systems that need your expertise with AI Hunter. Sign up for a personal demo today at securityweekly.com/ACM. This message is brought to you by Speerion. The data privacy revolution is the new age of protecting what matters most. Automatically and persistently discover and classify sensitive data with the most accurate solution on the planet. Understand the data within the context of your business and then take actions to control that data so you can operate with minimal friction and comply with the laws and regulations built to protect the personal data privacy of individuals across the globe. This is Speerion, protecting what matters most. Visit them on the web at securityweekly.com/Speerion.
And welcome to the show, but first, let me introduce you to the man, the myth, the legend, the inventor of Put Your Balls in the Box. No, seriously, it's a game with stress balls that you take and you throw at a ceiling fan and you try to get them in cut. Never mind. Mr. Possadori.
Welcome, everyone, to this edition of Paul's Security Weekly. It is episode 635, being recorded on Thursday, January 16th, 2020. With me here in studio are lots of people. I guess we'll introduce our guests during this segment as well, since they're sitting right here with us. First, of course, regular Security Weekly host, Mr. Larry Pesce is here with us. 15 years in the making. This is our 15th. This October will be 15 years.
It's mind-blowing.
Right?
You know,
pretty crazy.
Like, we've been doing this longer than we've owned houses and had children and
Yes.
been married.
Been married, at least for me. I think you were.
So you're like my podcast wife?
Yes. We've always said this, Larry. I mean, there's pictures.
And I'm your podcast husband, right?
There's pictures somewhere. Jeff Spielberg is a managing partner of Riverloop Security, and he is here with us for the show today. Jeff,
Thanks.
welcome.
Thank you. Really.
No relation to Steven.
You know, I wish I had a better story
And I
with
bet
that.
you get
I don't.
that.
Yeah,
And I bet
yeah.
you get that all the time.
Yeah.
You could make one up, though.
No,
mean,
I do need a better offhand story.
we
to
would
just
research
tell.
it later
Yeah.
and probably
Yeah.
prove it to be false, but
Right.
it would still be fun to tell the story.
Yeah.
But then it would be off air. Whatever.
Right? Too late. Ryan Speers is here with us. He is the a security researcher at Riverloop Security. Not the. You have more than one.
We have
sort
quite
of
a few.
security,
Yes.
Quite a few. Yeah. So you are one of
Indeed.
many security researchers at Riverloop Security.
Indeed. Yeah.
Fantastic. Welcome. Glad you guys could make it here in studio.
Thanks for having us.
Now to go to our remote host, Mr. Tyler Robinson is here with us. Tyler, welcome.
Thank you very much. Glad to be here.
And you are
It's a beautiful day in the winter cold of bitter freezing January in Idaho.
Yes. And you are sporting a suit jacket over your T-shirt, which is very interesting fashion choice for this evening.
It's like the startup thing to do, right? That's
I guess so.
wait,
I
we're
guess
not a startup. I don't know.
But are you wearing jeans and Crocs?
No freaking Crocs. That's not allowed.
It's way too cold to be wearing Crocs out there in Idaho.
Maybe some mucks. We could be wearing some mucks.
All right.
And Tyler, what's your role at NISO? So you a security researcher? What? I forget your title. I think I have it here in front of me.
He does too.
I'm managing director of network operations, so that means I research and work on operations and manage things. Apparently, I think.
Sweet.
Oh, and your in-studio guest is back.
The cat.
Yes, the cat is
waving
here.
cat.
Compliments of Mr. Corey Findlay.
Yep, waving down cat.
Very nice. Mr. Lee Neely is here with us. We don't often say Lee, what is your title and where do you work?
Well, I work out at
and
Lawrence
he's
Livermore
muted.
Laboratory. Am I muted?
Now, who's that?
Jeez.
No, you're good.
Oh,
There you go.
There we go. Okay. So I work out at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory. My title is Senior Cyber Analyst or something like that.
It is
I do a
senior
lot of
cyber
different
analyst.
things.
According to my notes, it's senior cyber analyst. So
Yes. I think that's one I made up. But anyway, it's lovely out here. I'm in California today. I'm on the other side of Idaho from Tyler, where it's a brisk 48 degrees right now. But I only got about a
I'm jealous.
half inch of snow in my front yard, so I'm sure I'm much better shape. And I have the self-shoveling sidewalks; they are clear. I haven't touched them.
well, Mr. Jeff Mann is here with us, and are you still at the beach, Jeff?
Still at the beach, yep. It's actually starting to get cold finally. It hit 71 degrees here on Sunday. I was tempted to go in the ocean until somebody told me the water temperature was 44 degrees.
That's really cold. And Jeff,
That's cold.
your title's really long. I mean, you are a senior InfoSec consultant for online business systems, which is your formal title.
Correct.
I guess I won't say it's informal, but crypt analyst, pioneering ex-NSA pen tester, PCI specialist, curmudgeon, tribe of hackers and InfoSec curmudgeon. It's a lot of descriptions.
It's a mouthful.
It is.
I wear a lot of hats, mostly because I'm bald and my head's cold.
It's great. Great point. Let's see. Quick announcement before we get started. Join us at InfoSec World 2020, March 30th through April 1st. For a 15% off discount code, you can go to securityweekly.com/ISW2020. Click the register button. Also, this year, RSA conference is being held February 24th through the 28th. And I have to say, for those in the community that are like, oh, poo-poo RSA, it's just a bunch of vendors, I've got some insights into this year's RSA, and I am excited. They've got areas where you can go meet up with people to talk about the projects that you're working on. They've even got multiple events, including an app that lets you kind of match what you're interested in with other people's interests and have this like gigantic space with a coffee bar where you can meet up with people. They've got like a speed dating event, and it's not dating like dating, but you're like, hi, my name's Paul, I'm interested in learning more about like AWS security or whatever, and you talk to someone else, right? And you got 3 minutes.
We're like AWS security, swipe right.
I would probably not get a date, right? And they've got villages. They've got hardware hacking villages, car hacking villages, aerospace hacking villages, where they have actual IoT devices that you can get your hands on and all kinds of cool stuff. So I was
Good they brought that in, yeah.
I was going to say, I wonder where they got that from.
Yeah, I hear
but
there's
good,
another
but good.
conference that's been doing
But
that.
good, yeah.
That's good.
That other conference isn't going to catch on. They've only,
Yeah, I
they've
heard
only been there a
I
couple
heard it
of
was
years.
canceled.
So really cool stuff going on at RSA. You can save $150 before January 24th. You save $900. Save an extra $150 by going to securityweekly.com/RSAC2020. If you are a college student, you can attend RSA for free. There is no charge for admittance on Thursday of the conference. And I want to say there's one morning event on Friday because they call it like college or scholastic day or whatever. So if you're in school, and especially if you're in the area, like you can totally go to RSA for free, which I thought was really, really awesome. They've also have 80 students that have been selected across 40 schools to get a full free boat trip to, or not boat, but you know what I mean. They pay for
That
the
could be
whole
limiting,
boat.
yeah.
But your airline, hotel, everything is paid for you if you're selected by your school to attend RSA. So
That's awesome.
I believe I'll have a chance to sit down and meet some of those 80 students while I'm there. So that's the reasons why I was really excited for RSA this year, because they've really worked hard to do some really cool things.
That's cool. Yeah.
Lots more. Well, it sounds like a lot more community type stuff to put people together.
Which is great. The nice part is we'll be in Broadcast Alley, just below what they're calling the engagement zone. Which I had to say,
putting a ring on it.
I was like, wait, is this like a
dating
place where, like,
engagement?
it's like a marriage proposal zone.
Well, they
said
got out the arches,
Right.
and you can pay for your wedding.
Now, I did ask. It is not against the rules to make a marriage proposal in the engagement zone. So, I mean, okay, that's cool, right? But the engagement zone is the one with the coffee bar and all the different areas and lounges where you can meet up with, which is great, because as I see my friends, be like, hey, let's go grab a coffee right upstairs. It's right up the escalators from where we'll be. So it's really cool. Actually, the topic is not RSA for this segment, but the topic is speaking with Ryan Speers and Jeff Spielberg about topics of IoT and what we used to call embedded systems hacking. And I don't know. I kind of miss that term, to be honest with you.
I always struggle with that. People are like, so what do you do? I'm like, well, we do embedded cybersecurity, focusing on the hardware level. They're like, oh, IoT. I'm like, yes, that too.
Okay.
Yeah.
To me, though, IoT encompasses, and Larry, I think you've even done some presentations on this. IoT, to me, encompasses the entire ecosystem, right? It's not just the device, the hardware, and the firmware. It's connections and APIs to the cloud, which also could encompass a web application where users log in, which could also encompass a mobile app, which could also encompass various wireless protocols. And all of that together working as a system, to me, is why you would call it the Internet of Things, right? Yeah. Because it's things connecting to each other, but also the Internet, right?
Yeah, absolutely. We see more and more of that, right? I think when we started doing embedded systems, IoT, in 2010 professionally, and I think back then it really was like individually connected devices. And yeah, they were connected to a network in one place. They had one touch point. But you weren't shipping them with a mobile app that was pairing them to your friends' mobile apps, because of course there has to be a social component, and there weren't all these cloud servers, so yeah, it's really changed. But it's fun. There's more attack surface to audit, right?
Yes. Job security. Yes.
Absolutely.
I have a philosophical question.
Go ahead,
What was the internet full of before it was full of things?
Cats.
Yes. I believe that's the actual factually correct answer.
See, and
I want to say it was
porn.
like military, government, and university computers.
I think Larry's probably right.
Porn.
We'll go with cats.
Porn's probably the best.
Which is just another name for
Porn.
cats, if you think about it.
It depends at which point in time are we talking about? Like early days internet, where it was basically DARPA?
Well,
And a few
before
universities,
it became the Internet of Things. What was before that? What was the Internet of?
Oh, then the answer is definitely porn. So.
Yeah. Haven't you heard the song "The Internet is for Porn"?
Let's not.
No.
Let's. So we've talked about this particular problem for some time. In fact, Larry and I co-authored a book on WRT54G wireless hacking, and started really digging into, ways to hack. But we used hack in like the late 1960s MIT sense of the word. Hack, right? But as we looked at various things on this platform, we're like, wow, now we're learning how firmware and hardware works in the embedded space, and specifically how to break apart firmware and all of these vulnerabilities. And I think since then, Larry and I have pretty much always had a project or some type of thing to do with embedded devices and or IoT, because we saw basically how horrible the security was, like basically non-existent security in terms of running that book. Now we fast forward to today, we've somewhat survived. We came up with some bruises and scrapes and cuts from the Mirai botnet, right? And a lot of IoT security-related issues are making the mainstream news, although it somewhat, I think, kind of sugarcoats the issue, right? And so we've talked a lot on the show about how do we secure these devices. And I know this is like not an easy question, right? And something that requires much debate. But it's still true today that manufacturers of hardware and software are releasing devices that are consumed by enterprises and general consumers that leave out huge missing pieces in terms of security. How do we, we can talk about the problems too, but how do we improve this problem? How do we make the world a better place when it comes to IoT?
Yeah, how do we design it in from the start, right? Why are we, I think the question I ask myself a lot is, hey, I'm pen testing another product, really interesting product. People want it in their businesses, in their homes. But I'm seeing the same vulnerabilities over and over, right?
Yeah.
And we can all rag on specific ones, and it's probably fair to do.
Right.
But, I think the question we've been looking at, especially I'd really say probably for us since 2015, is how can we design security in from the start, right? We've had years of pen testing, finding the same things, going super deep, find the same things, find a lot of really new interesting things. How can we take those same things and just cross them off the list? I mean, if we're finding those in pen tests, we're not doing something right as an industry at this point. So
Ryan, Jeff, I've identified some of those fundamental things just so we don't, I think, kind of like bore our listeners, right? We've talked about the authentication issues, right? I mean, I break this down into like multiple different areas. There's default passwords, there's backdoor passwords, there's weak passwords, right? There's no passwords, all of which are really like 4 different conditions that you could find sometimes on the same platform. I don't know if I've seen all 4. I'm sure it exists on the same platform. But and it's not just authentication for administration, but also authentication for the user side of it, right? So the user can interface with the device. So that's really probably one of the most major issues is authentication. You could even segue off of that credential management into how do I validate that the software running on my hardware is in fact valid from the manufacturer and does not contain any unauthorized function, software, code, what have you, in the terms of backdoors. Is it really coming from the manufacturer? That firmware validation oftentimes is related very much to authentication and credential management on these devices is often missing.
Absolutely.
Yeah, for sure. And I would even just step back from the authentication authorization and firmware integrity issues. One of the things we see manufacturers not taking into account is just security in the early part of design, right? And in to the point that and how IoT has evolved over the last few years, security hasn't been at the forefront, and so we tend to see issues even down to the hardware level. So, right, what microcontroller are people? What chips are people choosing on their devices? And we often end up in situations where we say, all right, we want to improve the integrity checking on firmware. We want to improve the authentication or authorization scheme. But the microcontroller on this piece of hardware doesn't have the power, doesn't have the memory space to do it. And you can't do a new turn on your hardware and ship it to your 1 million customers who have something deployed in the field.
Right.
So is that a general problem of just vendors trying to save cost and or the cost of consumers expecting products to be at a certain price point for IoT or embedded devices?
Yeah, I mean, that's a huge issue. So hardware costs, the BOM costs, the bill of materials, and an extra 10 cents per chip on on every device. If you plan to make 5 million of them, that starts adding up.
Right. Also, there's how long are you going to support this product in the market, whether it's enterprise or consumer, right? Why would I build all that stuff in if I know this is just going to be like a burner throwaway thing, and if people want to run it for the rest of their lives, then poo-poo on you. You should just go buy my next new thing. So I want to maximize my revenue for 5 years.
Planned obsolescence.
I'm going to put it, maybe patch it for bug fixes as long in that 5-year window. Hope as many people buy it as possible. Then I'm going to come out the next thing. And if you are one of those millions of people, right, to your point, Jeff, millions of devices out there, I want you to go spend more money with me and buy the next newest thing. I'm not supporting that anymore. So why would I build something into it that could support it for 10 or 15 or 20 years when I know it's a 5-year life cycle?
Yeah, we see that around key rotation all the time. We're like, okay, guys, so often when we're working with people and it's, hey, we don't want to add BOM cost and being really sensitive to that. Okay, how can we still get some security in there?
Right.
How can we still meet your threat model threshold? And that's where I love it, because as somebody who does cryptanalysis and cryptography and designing hardware systems, like, okay, how do we make that work, right? And
Careful, Jeff's
what's the
going to have
best we can
questions
do?
for you. I'm just
Hey,
forewarning you
we'll
right
have
now.
questions for him. Right? That's
Jeff's gonna have a
okay. I
healthy
hear we have a
debate.
news topic for Jeff to cover in a little bit. So, and so as we go through that, you know, how do we design those in? How do we pick how can we make it work on these constrained parts? But to your point of like obsolescence and so forth, get into like the classic thing, right? Like, okay, we need to plan for key rotation, right? On enterprise systems, this is something that comes up in every vendor due diligence. In IoT, key rotation, well, when should I do that? Well, in 10 to 15 years. Okay, well, will people still be using this? That's a legitimate question. Do we want them to still be using it? Why do I have to engineer that now? It's like, well, if you do it now, it's actually fine. If you do it in 15 years, it's going to be really painful.
Right.
Or impossible, right?
Right. Because now it potentially comes down to some of the hardware selection that you did. If you need to, not so much. Yep.
Yeah.
But there's also what you both do this every day, right? You're analyzing devices in firmware and hardware for security vulnerabilities. The security of that said software, it's down to the bootloader, right?
Yep.
And it's down to the in the firmware level, as well as the web interface and just code running inside of the firmware, tends to be pretty poor. I mean, buffer overflows, really insecure web services. It still proliferates the IoT market today.
Absolutely. Take like the OWASP top 10 from 5 years ago and apply
it
right?
to IoT.
Take your basic buffer overflows that we've talked about for years. And so this is a great question for you two, because you're analyzing, I would imagine, some of the newer platforms.
Mm-hmm.
There's no like address randomization. There's some
in very few platforms.
Okay,
It's actually
so it's still in very few platforms.
Yeah, and people are adding it. And one of the things we do, and when we build automated tools to help go through things, we're looking at those type of things. Like, hey, do we have NX bits set? No, not execute bits for data execution prevention. Do we have address randomization? Do we have Linux railroad? Like, all these basic things. Like, let's get these into our systems to make exploitation tougher, right? The thing with exploits, when we find them and then show our customers them, it's like, well, what did you have to do to get that to run? Well, once we found the bug, we had to play around with the stack a little bit, but there was no ASLR to bypass in most cases. And actually, I was looking at something the other day, and there were some mitigations in a few of the binaries. But interestingly, about like 25% of the binaries had no mitigations, which I feel like in enterprise software or other things, we're used to like a consistent build system is building our entire platform. And if mitigation is turned on, it's turned on. Right, and obviously Windows and people have had issues with this in the past, but we see that a lot in IoT. Like, okay, so those 3 binaries were built on a developer's personal box, and then put into the firmware image.
Absolutely.
But you know what's interesting is you were before talking about how like sometimes all the flaws aren't. You identify one particular flaw, like a buffer overflow, and then there's more points in the code in other binaries that have that same flaw. We've seen this in embedded systems all the time, right? They fix it in that one point. But that same overflow, that same condition that leads to a security vulnerability exists in different points in the code and different binaries. And you were also describing a scenario where it just sounds like there's poor software development practices. Like normally, if you look at even people who are trying to get to be a full DevOps shop, right? Even if they're not quite there, there's still elements that would catch all of this, right? There's software composition analysis that can tell me I'm not building in or including a library that has a vulnerability already, which is prolific. At least when I looked at it, it's still true today,
always,
right? In IoT and embedded systems today, if I configure my linter to say it should look for this particular condition in the code, if it's in 16 other places, the developer should know it's in 16 other places, right? Then there's static analysis and binary analysis before I check it in, even, right? Or maybe once it's built in the QA.
As soon as I get a branch build to give me that feedback. Yeah.
Right. You can do it in code or can do it in binaries depending on where in your build process. I mean, there's actually open source software that they could use that would catch majority of these bugs. And it seems to me like none of the IoT manufacturers are implementing this. Do you guys know why, or is there reasons for this?
I mean, I think we see some who use, right? A number of people we work with use it, and I think there's the traditional issues with, and we've been, working a lot in this field to try to solve those problems that you're talking about, right? So, the source code analysis in IoT, I see hits a few issues commonly, and Jeff can jump in here. But one is, hey, it's the typical issue. We get a lot of false positives, overwhelms the developers. Like, really? Do I really have 500 issues? No, you probably have like 30 that are exploitable. Well, okay, maybe 200, but not the 500, right? And
is that because they're developing on chipsets that aren't as common? Like, because if you developed in Python or Node or React,
really good
right?
Analyzers.
Your analyzers work pretty well, but developers in this sense, they're developing probably in C, right?
Often.
And probably for MIPS or ARM processors. Is the software that checks that type of software maybe not as robust?
I think a lot of the source sync analysis that the static code analyzers do is limited, right? Your data input's not always coming from a URL handler, right? It's not even coming through Nginx all the time, right? So it's like these tools that have been made for this can be applied. I think what I'd like to say is the techniques can be applied to IoT. The tools really need to be targeting IoT to be successful. That's not taking a tool and throwing a thing on it that says it now does IoT. That's designing a tool for IoT from the start, right? The number of ways you get your input in, right? It's not receive socket buffer, URL handler, Bluetooth, custom RF chips, UARTs, right? Like, these are not sources and syncs that a web application analysis software knows to look for, right?
That's interesting.
So is maturity of their process, their familiarity with using these types of tools a factor at all? It sounds like it might be that the focus of the tools isn't up to the job to help them be successful, rather than them not being as familiar with using these sorts of tools.
I think it's probably a little of both. I think that's a fair point, right? I think people are trying to use them. When you get hit by those overwhelming false positives, that's not fun for anyone. It's not fun for the security team who's trying to justify the tools. It's not fun for the developer, right? No one's having a good time there. I guess the other thing we see a lot with source code analysis is, hey, we're developing for a code size constrained device, right? And we may have this big build project that's going to build for tons of different devices across our ecosystem. It's going to build for a camera, it's going to build for a door lock, it's going to build for whatever, right? Well, we're not putting all that code into every device, right? And so a lot of it's going to be compiled out. And the development build chains are pretty unique for IoT. If you're building for certain vendors' chips, you need to use their build chain for the compilers, right? This is not like just throw it in LLVM for everything.
Give me like heart palpitations from like past experience of cross-compiling and using build chains for ARM and MIPS is...
So how do you expect the source code analyzer to know that build chain, right? And
when I want to stick a fork in my eye just trying to get it to work, right? I mean, you guys know exactly what
much
it's like
less
to do
the
that.
analysis.
Yeah.
And so you get these things where they're not taking into account what code's actually in the product. So you're scanning, 100% of the code when 20% of it ends up in the product. Okay, by definition, 80% of the bugs don't matter to that product development team.
Right.
It's going to be really painful to explain to them why they should spend time fixing this.
Well, also, I think there's some merit to, like, I got a really slimmed down web server and web app built, right, that can talk over HTTP or HTTPS, and I'm going to reuse that because it was a lot of work to get that, my build, my tool chain working, the build chain, and compress down that web application. It's almost like a pseudo web application, right, to run in this small space. And what I've seen in the past is that just gets reused and resold, right? Sometimes there's a third party that develops that is either acquired or working with the vendor. And the best example I'm thinking of is with D-Link and Joel's Backdoor. That was totally Chinese company creates this compressed down web server. I don't know if they were working with D-Link or D-Link bought them or they're a subcontractor, but that web server code ended up in like 18 different models of D-Link because they're like, oh, cool. We've got a web server that's 34K rather than 300K, right?
Why wouldn't we use it?
Why wouldn't we use it, right? And it has heinous vulnerabilities. I mean, you basically set your user agent to it was like Joel's Backdoor spelled backwards or something like that, right?
Right in.
And you're right in.
Yeah, which brings up a good point, right? Often you're in embedded, you're not necessarily building not everything in the product is your own code, right? You're taking components that either
That were built by Joel.
Gave you, Joel gave you, or your chip vendor gave you, right?
Mm-hmm.
And your chip vendor
over
says,
open source.
Yeah.
A lot.
And all of those. But think the chip vendor gives you one that's closed source. It's made for their chip. It's going to do this magical thing. You're going to call into it. It's going to solve your problem for you.
Well, back in the day was talk to your Wi-Fi chipset.
Broadcom. Yeah,
in a
Broadcom
binary,
drivers.
right? In a
Broadcom
binary
binary
blob.
blobs. Yeah.
Exactly. So you take that, you build it in, like, well, how are you going to do? Right? So this is why a lot of the times we're looking at binary analysis to solve these problems.
So binary blobs are still a thing.
Alive and well.
But I also think that really makes it difficult for the manufacturer to keep that updated, because that binary blob is tied to a certain, if it's Linux, kernel version, which holds back the rest of your... That's still going on today, isn't it? You're looking at me like that's still going on today.
I just got done where a team was going through, an old Linux kernel, trying to figure out could we get them to update it, and what were the things locking it down, and what in it was exposed and exploitable to drive them to update it.
Well, I mean, local privilege escalation in older Linux. I mean, forget.
Well, you don't need privilege escalation when everything runs as root.
This is true, which is another issue we see all the time. But
so it's just like containers then.
Yeah.
What's that line from Steve Gibson? Security? I'd forgotten about it completely.
Yep. Yes.
What do you think the biggest thing that we're going to see this year from kind of IoT devices and or botnets, and maybe what can either manufacturers or consumers do to best protect that?
I don't know, Jeff. You want to take this? Who wants to?
Yeah, I don't want to be the one who's wrong on the future. But
you'd be in the majority, Jeff.
We
technically accurate.
You're good.
We promise we won't hold you to it.
And
Get Jeff another drink.
Yeah, I think the unfortunate thing is it's going to come down to a lot of the simple stuff still. Back to what we said at the beginning of authentication and authorization, open ports, things like some of the things I'm sure we'll be discussing in the news this week. And those we're going to see over and over again. And I think
credential management.
I think
right?
there was one of the analyst reports this year, it was saying that this is the year that connected devices are going to outnumber computers and phones on the internet, right? So, which is scary. That's where we are today.
Well, I did my part. I installed 12 Wise cameras in the last week and a half. So even after they got compromised, I still bought them. Which is also some of the things that consumers still do.
Right. That's the thing. And I'm very interested to see what some of Apple and others introduce large initiatives around security consortia for these sort of things. We'll see where any of that goes.
Microsoft had Azure Sphere.
Yep.
Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Which I thought was great because it addressed pretty much all the issues we've talked about thus far, and ones we haven't. Right. Like why should my BIOS and or bootloader boot firmware that it shouldn't trust? It isn't signed,
exactly.
Right? Like that would be awesome. That would wipe out an entire class of attacks in the IoT attack surface. But these new frameworks exist, but it's going to take a long time before they see adoption. If they see adoption, right?
Right.
Because now you're raising the bar, right? Expensive. You're raising if it's not direct cost, it's time and resources to design, plan, and implement and use a trusted computing platform for Microsoft that's developed for IoT, which I talked to the person who was firsthand helped develop that. I was like, dude, you're awesome, and that whole program is awesome, and it solves so many security issues that we have with IoT. But how do we get manufacturers to adopt it?
Right, and that's one of the things of IoT grew up essentially out of the hobbyist market, right? So I learned on Arduinos. That's how I started, and I think that's how most of us in the embedded state we were just looking at one earlier, right?
Because they still are a thing.
Because they're still a thing, and that's how all of us learned embedded, right? And that follows through into how people in colleges are learning embedded, and therefore how the people who are out building these things in the market have learned it. So I think it's going to take some time to shift that mindset from, I'm in a lab building a little thing based on microcontroller that provides all this stuff for me, and I'm gonna roll it all myself, to how do we move to some of those platforms that provide a lot of those benefits.
Mm-hmm. I'm also frankly worried about a false sense of security there, right? And it's like if you build on a trusted platform and your code still has a Joel backdoor in it.
Yeah, it's true.
We haven't solved it, right? So we can't
adopt
these.
There's
we
still
still
a
have to
lowest
audit
common
our code.
denominator.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah. How do we get on the device? maybe
I
not the
think
bootloader, right?
I think the biggest danger, rather than a false sense of security, which I think is legitimate, is more along the lines of people just don't care. People don't think about it. People just, hey, it works.
I'd probably also argue that there's a certain sort of rush to market. Like, we've got the world's next best thing that we need to get to the market now. We need to make sure our costs are reasonable, that the 10 cents per chip for 5 million units. And this needs to be in the market yesterday. Get it done. Make it work.
Oh, absolutely.
Make it work.
Yeah. Yeah, you want to get it on the Home Depot shelf so people put your door lock in instead of someone else's.
Exactly.
Absolutely. And although, we look back at our last few years of data a few months ago and in an attempt to convince a lot of folks we work with that, no, you really need to build security in. And we were finding that a bunch of companies we work with have had stuff published, right? Like everyone does. Their CVs filed by researchers. Stuff gets published. Stuff gets hacked. And we looked through our data and said, you're actually spending more money just responding to one researcher reporting one vulnerability in your devices than you would spend actually taking a few extra weeks and thinking through security at the start and architecting it in. And so that's the argument we're really trying to make now. So,
Excuse me.
I mean, that argument fails over to not only like IoT, but we've made that similar argument and been trying to quantify that for years on network security and breaches.
Yeah.
So the fact that IoT is almost beating us to the punch with some good hard evidence, I think, is a huge statement to what you guys are doing. And honestly, like IoT from a risk standpoint of the internet as a whole and or even your network security, like these are big deals. You look at how a lot of these botnets and APT groups are actually working. Almost everything is being ran through a botnet, at least for a lot of the initial access, a lot of the denial of service, relaying for C2 channels. Like if it's good C2, it's going to be using a botnet to relay through. So this is going to continue to be an issue. And APT groups, while everybody's worried about the latest APT group and TTP there, like they're leveraging all these IoT devices and no one is kind of putting a lot of extra emphasis around those particular things.
Are you saying IoT is a cyber weapon, Tyler?
Absolutely.
Better start regulating
biggest.
Wow. That's a debate if you want to go down that road.
No, I don't.
Okay.
I mean, we can.
So I
ahead,
have a
Jeff.
somewhat mundane question. That's Mr. Jeff to you.
Mr. Jeff, man.
Just for this episode.
Mr. Man.
I mean, I'm working with a customer right now that's has point of sale systems in play that are built on embedded operating systems. I'm curious, how in today's language, in today's vernacular, how do we distinguish between an embedded device and an IoT device? Is there a clear line of demarcation, or are the lines blurred? Because I'm sitting here wondering, like, all the devices that I'm working with my customer on, would they be considered an IoT device, even though they're built on an embedded operating system and they're a device? I'm just curious.
Yeah. I mean, I break it down into sort of three categories, right, of major devices we see. Obviously not representative of everything, right?
Okay.
Things on embedded Linux, things on real-time operating systems, and things that are bare metal, right? And bare metal is we have an entry point, we have a loop, and we're going to spin through our state machine, and probably starting with a framework from
That's
the
what I
chip
think it was
vendor,
more of like microcontroller.
Yeah.
Right? Like
yeah, exactly.
there's no operating system for your code to run on.
Yeah.
It's you're just running code on the chip.
Yeah.
Right?
Exactly.
That's the way I understand it.
Exactly.
Now, real-time operating system, not Linux. What, for our audience, are we talking about when we say real-time operating system?
Yeah, something like FreeRTOS is a vendor that makes it commercially. VxWorks, stuff like
Because
that.
VxWorks is considered an
it's considered. And they're starting to get blurry lines
They do.
here, right?
VxWorks
And
especially, I agree.
as people try to add features, make it commercial, people want things from it. But I think
But then embedded, you've got embedded Linux or embedded Windows or any other kind of embedded, where basically they're taking a full operating system and putting it in a
slimming
smaller.
it down.
Yeah, slimming it down.
Yeah, exactly. So I think the difference between that is, between an embedded Linux, embedded Windows, and an RTOS is just how your kernel scheduler is working for a process.
True.
That's the only. I mean, now the lines are so close. That's really the difference, right?
I read a book back when we were doing writing our own book that was describing real-time operating systems, and I thought it was a good analogy. They thought about when you're flying a plane, right? The sensors and the data that you're getting has to be as near real time as possible. So every system is very purpose-built and sending the pilot data as soon as possible through multiple processes in basically doing the scheduling so the pilot gets the most important information, such as altitude, first, right?
Yeah.
Before anything else. The systems that an airplane would use to regulate other non-important things, I mean, maybe not the landing gear, because that's pretty important too,
I hear it.
right?
Yeah, it's key to get that down.
It's key to get that down, right?
We should not
But
block that process.
I guess there's a lot of systems on a plane. What would be a not important
Temperature
system?
control, cabin lighting, stuff like this.
Cabin lighting is well, temperature depending on
could
where
be
could be
critical.
very
Yeah.
it could be very critical.
Cabin
But
lighting for sure.
cabin lighting for sure, right? Would
Whether
be
the
one of those
seatbelt
systems
sign
that
is
doesn't
on.
get priority.
Oh, that's important.
But in a regular operating system, the priority of all of those tasks, the lines are just kind of blurred, and it's really left up to the developer and how it's implemented.
You can request priorities, but you're not guaranteed that your loop is going to hit and fire that within a certain number of microseconds.
It's so nerdy. I'm glad we had a chance to go down this path.
But that's why we see things like a alarm system sensor that says when your door is open or closed. Could work on bare metal. A lot of industrial applications are RTOS or VX workspace due to that timing constraint, and then all the IoT, your Wise camera, things like that are embedded Linux.
So if one of the questions I had for you both is, in your notes you mentioned FW Analyzer, which I love. It's an awesome, tool, especially for just getting started into it. It's a great tool. If you want to start analyzing firmware, I'm assuming you're going to go to the more Linux-based firmwares that are running on MIPS or ARM to kind of get your feet wet, right? I mean, that's good, like good middle ground. You maybe don't want to start with an RTOS. You maybe don't want to start with get an Arduino and start playing around with that would be a microcontroller example, right? It would be an Arduino. I would say start with FW Analyzer. What other tools and methods do you recommend if you're going to get started in analyzing firmware? I mean, strings. For a lot of what we're talking about, because it's like hacking in the 90s, strings is awesome, right?
So it's like, what's your composition analysis, right? If you're rolling your own, I think Colin did a great job with FW Analyzer of taking those common open source things, bundling it in, and being like, okay, what do we start for? We start checking for versions of products that are in it, right? I think that's where most people start. And soon they go to, and correlate to CVEs. Now that's a very oversimplified view, right? When you do this at scale and you do it commercially and you need to do it accurately, that will not work for a variety of reasons. Right. But for getting started, absolutely. Strings, throw it into Google, find the CVE. Probably a good place to start.
Strings, you can find passwords too. I mean, even still today, right?
Write a regex for a cloud computing provider's authentication token, and now we're living IoT. Now we're living the internet part of it, right?
RSA private keys.
Right.
Any of those.
It's nice that they label it in PEM format. You don't even have to do a binary comparison. I think we've spent a lot of time since 2018 sort of looking at how do we take a lot of the stuff that we've done manually over years with unpacking firmware, right? And how do we make that into a product that people can use? I forget which one you mentioned. Put it into your build system every time the developer commits. Get that quick feedback, because a lot of what we're seeing is if we can give developers accurate, non-false positive data quickly, they'll stop. They want to be secure. They're going to stop making that mistake, rather than if we, as penetration testers, we're going to test that. We can't test that every day on every branch. I mean, we'd be happy to if they want us to, but it's not realistic. Right?
And you folks have at Riverloop have built such a system, right?
Yeah.
There's only so many other companies that commercially and publicly make available those services that are basically like, we built an entire system that you can give us your firmware file, blob, and we'll analyze it and we'll spit back all the vulnerabilities. Now, obviously, there's a ton of stuff under the covers that's going on. There's static analysis. There's trying to tear apart the firmware. I mean, tearing apart the firmware manually is hard. Then to progress to that state of automating it, I mean, the headaches that you had to have gone through to just say, how do I extract the file system? I mean, I've literally spent days
and what is
in various
file
firmwares
system?
trying to figure out what this file system is and extract it and be able to mount it.
And
right?
then people include like their readmes and then their Windows installer in the firmware package, and then you get that, and you're like, no, that's not what we want. We want the actual embedded Linux file system.
Right.
And then there's 5 file systems.
I was going to say there's definitely more than one file system.
You got your backup, your rollback firmware,
right.
all of that. And we try to make it work with like things that come off the build system, but also that people extract from chips, right? If you're doing hardware hacking, right? Larry, we talked about this a lot, right? Lifting the chip, trying to dump out the firmware from inside it. So we want to be able to work on all of that. So yeah, that's a challenge. I
There's
mean,
a lot in there. Yeah.
Getting started, open source, use a tool like Binwalk. I mean, on some firmwares, use a
Binwalk
tool
is
like
awesome.
Zip.
Yep.
Right.
Yeah. Sometimes it works great. Yeah.
But it's a lot of customization and tweaking and proprietary file formats that we have
memorizing all the
engineers
magic
do.
numbers that represent files and file systems definitely helps too.
It does.
Good bedtime reading.
Well, actually, Binwalk does a really good job of doing that for you.
Yeah,
right? I mean, that's
with the
basically what
common ones,
Binwalk is doing, is those magic numbers that represent the beginning of a particular type of file and/or file system. Right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah.
Those are good tools. So I would say for more automated tools, Binwalk and FW Analyzer would be a good place to start.
For open source tools that are out there that you can jump on. Yeah. Absolutely.
What about trying to emulate the firmware? You guys are laughing already because this is like one of the harder engineering challenges.
Because Ryan just dealt with months of fighting with trying to do this in an automated fashion. Yeah.
Just for our audience, months, right? Because it's not trivial, because there are so many different ways to construct a firmware package, and there are so many different chipsets and chipset types, right? When we say MIPS in ARM, those are general classes of architecture. Inside of MIPS, there's 30 some odd different or something.
Yeah,
high
a few less
20s.
that are often used, but there's different
of
versions
different types of MIPS architectures.
ARM architectures vary depending on
versions.
Yeah, absolutely.
And you'd like flip a coin to see what the byte order is on any one of those different architectures, which I mean that can really slow you down, right?
Yeah, no, Jeff was laughing. I guess I was laughing, right? It's, one of the features we've added to our product recently is because, we want to do dynamic analysis, and startup emulation gives us a lot of really interesting data, to the point that we talked about earlier, false positives. Where should we focus, right?
But it's awesome not to have to require that you get the hardware running, right?
Exactly,
To be able to emulate that firmware gives you a lot of insights. Now, is it QEMU? Largely
under the hood, a lot of times it's that's what's used. People do, there's different engines like Unicorn Engine that'll do even more fine-grained emulation. I mean, I think the thing that everyone points to in firmware, like the classic example of why emulation's hard, is because there are hardware peripherals that we don't know about. The firmware doesn't tell us much at all about these, right? The chip designers have to lay these out, and this is one of the fun things as a security researcher. Like I was taught by my thesis advisor. He said, where you look for bugs is at boundaries of abstraction or boundaries of incompetence, and boundaries of incompetence are where you get good bugs. Right. So I love looking between the hardware and the firmware level, right at those interfaces, and that's where okay, one person built this side, one person built this side, and surprise, people don't communicate perfectly all the time, right? And
or at all.
Or I was being generous, but that's where you get the good bugs. So that's tough to emulate.
But one reason, what I hear you saying is, one reason emulation is hard is because to emulate all of the chips that this firmware is supposed to run on it. So if I'm trying to emulate some firmware and my Wi-Fi chipset isn't being emulated or isn't there at all, that firmware may not, the kernel, everything may just come
not boot.
May not boot at all, right?
Yeah. Whether it's NVRAM, whether it's another chip you need on the board.
Right.
Yeah.
Well,
a lot of edge cases.
NVRAM doesn't necessarily come inside your firmware.
No.
Right.
That's in the
in the processor die.
It's in the flash chip.
Yeah.
And so you don't know what that is. If you have the firmware without the flash chip to look at NVRAM, you don't know what it's expecting.
Yeah, you may not, right? And so you take you have a lot of heuristics. You take really educated guesses. And we work over millions and millions of firmware images to get this tuned right to work at scale.
Right.
It's a really interesting, right? But I think that having the dynamic analysis, having the static analysis combined helps get a lot more visibility into what's happening.
Because you're not always going to be able to emulate
get
the firmware.
No.
Yeah. Yeah.
Despite months sometimes. of work.
Despite a team who focuses on this every day. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
That's awesome. Questions from our remote host. Did we lose Lee? Is Lee still there?
He's working his way back now.
Lee appears to have become an icon.
He is a Skype.
The Skype icon.
He is a Skype icon.
Mr. Jeff and Tyler.
There's a lot to cover here. IoT and/or embedded. Like I feel like that doesn't even kind of touch a lot of probably some of the cool things you guys are seeing with embedded systems, say in the ICS space. Anything from the PLCs to how those particular real-time operating systems are handling security and/or getting better or not getting better.
Now, having to defend against nation states, someone was talking earlier about how, we have the best cyber experts here in the U.S., and therefore we're resilient to nation-state attacks. I'm like, hold on, let's back up a second. The U.S. has more infrastructure in general than many countries, and we certainly have a lot more connected infrastructure.
We're a great attack surface.
And we have a much larger, therefore, as Ryan, we have a lot more attack surface. So we could have some of the best cyber security experts in the world, but we still have a much larger attack surface. And my fear is that attack surface in the industrial control system space is more than we can defend against nation states. Yeah. Because the security level, while better in some aspects of ICS than others, still suffers from many of the issues we discussed in this segment, no?
Right. It's no different. And I think and we also don't think as much as we probably should have, although we're starting to about the supply chain and where those things come from, right? So, maybe here,
go there,
right, not to go to supply chain, but we say we have all the experts here, but where are the devices coming from and how are we validating them, right?
Yeah.
So,
and how do you validate them, how you bring them in, right? I mean, a lot of times when we're doing we're sort of combining on a lot of our projects deep hardware analysis, ripping apart the boxes, going down to the individual chips with the firmware analysis that we were just talking about. And when we do supply chain validation projects, it's open up a lot of equipment, identify a lot of things, and think.
But that's a whole new level,
right?
Right. What is the technology called that you basically can put a sniffer between the various chips?
Yeah,
like an interposer or something.
Yeah. We're doing some research on.
Don't start there. If you're just getting into this, that's probably not the place to start, but something to be aware of, that interfacing at the hardware level can get you data and or software off of the device. But that's typically, typically when we're talking about a supply chain attack, right?
Yeah. And
if someone's trying to hide the fact that they've backdoored a device, sometimes the only way to get in to see what's going on is to do
and I may also argue, and you guys can back me up or not, using those same methodologies for the interposers, doing that bus sniffing is also fantastic for us as attackers to get information off the wire. So why would they not want to do that?
Yeah. So. I mean, it's do we harden our devices from the physical angle? And sometimes people are like, no, that's not the threat model. Okay, in some cases that's valid, but in a lot of cases, whether it's supply chain or if it's after the device has been deployed, right? To Tyler's question, think about ICS. You're putting devices out by definition in the field away from people. You are monitoring a pipeline in the middle of a field, miles and miles and miles from anything that we're going to call a secure space, right? I mean, I would advocate that a hardware attack is a very realistic threat there.
I agree.
We're looking at, so say we even do secure boot, right? You brought up secure boot earlier, and oftentimes people have a TPM or an embedded in a crypto coprocessor that are on their board.
Or UEFI? Is that a thing on embedded systems? I know it has some inroads, some, right?
Yeah, and some systems will have that. But if you're talking to an external chip, right, now there's this communication across the bus that we can sniff, but even more importantly, we can change. We can change a successful firmware validation, or more importantly, we can change an unsuccessful firmware validation response to be successful, right? And that's like a simple bus interposition attack. I mean, it takes a little work to hide and miniaturize to the point that it makes it
You say
reliable.
simple because this is your world.
It's fair. It's a pain, right? To do, and to do it well as an attacker, to do it stealthily.
To have a repeatable attack that you could send a plant or nation state attacker somewhere in the U.S. to gain access to that device, right?
Right. But you have things you add to the board, right? I sort of break it down into when you're doing a supply chain attack, and did a presentation for DARPA's Supply Chain Security Summit this past year on their security track. to kick it off, and I forget exactly, but I think broke it down to adding something to the board, replacing something on the board, changing the board design itself, right? All of these are legitimate ways. You can take one chip that looks this way, make another one that's the same package that has something different inside it, right? You can swap it for one that you control. You can reprogram it. Like the possibilities when we control the hardware are limited only by.
We've gone almost an hour. We haven't talked about JTAG yet.
Okay.
I was going to bring up JTAG.
And we also haven't talked about Zigbee and Killer B as well.
Oh, fair enough.
So I want to go there first because our good friend Josh Wright, whom I've known since I started at the university in 2001. I sat in a presentation from Josh, right? And ever since then, I've just been enamored with all of Josh's research, and he's been a great friend since then. But Josh wrote Killer B to attack the Zigbee protocol.
Yeah.
And now you folks have taken that over, kind of.
We stole it from him. No.
Because Josh is very much the kind of guy that gets a project to where it does what he wants it to do, and then he's done. Because it fulfilled a task that
it fulfilled his needs.
It fulfilled his needs. And
no, it was great. I mean, when I was doing my thesis and stuff with Ricky, our other co-founder, and we were working on what should we learn how to exploit, and Zigbee was a brand new protocol then.
I'd still say a pretty wide open attack surface, still pretty well deployed, right?
Yeah, and increasingly so, yeah.
Right, because I use a SmartThings at home specifically because it will do Z-Wave, Zigbee, and Wi-Fi like all on the same platform.
Yeah.
So I can pretty much buy most of what's on the market and get it connected
integrate
into
with
my
that
smart home.
Right. We've actually been surprised at seeing how we thought it might be one of those things that in a couple years, it's a few years ago people used to use that old thing, but we're seeing increasing adoption, increasing standardization on Zigbee for a lot of smart
We talked about a Chamberlain smart garage door
doors,
opener.
Yeah.
And I believe we theorized it was Zigbee. I don't know if the reports told us it was Zigbee.
At least some models are.
Some of the models
are probably
I believe so.
right?
Yeah.
Yep, definitely some are. But yeah, so Josh had done the work on Killer Bee, and it was great to collaborate with him on the research. And then as he moved on to other interesting projects, we've been trying to do our best to keep it going and improve it and add features, different chipsets, like Larry and us are always talking about.
Yep, absolutely.
So that's really interesting thing about embedded systems, right? The operating system varies, the chip and architecture of that chip varies, right? And then all of the wireless chips it uses varies. And the versions of the wireless protocols, not just 802.11 or any kind of Wi-Fi, but also Zigbee and or Z-Wave and or Bluetooth can vary on all of these devices as well and have different chips and or different versions of the protocol that they're implementing.
And oftentimes, right, backwards compatibility. If you're making a device that has to talk to anything that Larry wants to buy off the shelf, right, we come out with new versions, and I did an analysis when both Z-Wave and Zigbee came out with a new version of their protocol, right? Security Plus for Z-Wave, if I remember correctly, and Zigbee 3.
Z-Wave Pro?
S2, Security 2, for Z-Wave and Zigbee 3.0, and they both came out around the same time, I forget, a year or two ago, and like, hey, great, we're putting more security trust in. Actually, it was really fun because a lot of our feedback to some of the users had made it into the protocols at this point. We're like, great, we've locked down some of these issues. It's
great.
Realistically,
if the manufacturers implement those said protocols.
And require you to use the new version and not downgrade, and it's a tough challenge, right? They want to support.
It's a challenge we fought, and it's somewhat still fighting with Wi-Fi today, right?
Yeah,
sure.
With IP, right?
Yeah.
And it creates it's difficult in terms of tooling, right? So from the IoT space, every manufacturer wants to build anything, whatever chips they're choosing. They need the right test equipment. They need the right test gear. Security researchers need the right test gear. So we're talking about, even for ourselves and some of the stuff we've developed internally, well, we need to do another turn on that now because the protocols have evolved and the types of things have evolved. Right. So it's hard to keep up with that stuff. The tooling's just not there yet.
Right. This is why we make our own tools for that and make our own tools for the firmware. I mean, sometimes we got to make those, right?
And so do you also make some of your own tools for JTAG, or do you buy pretty much off-the-shelf JTAGulator?
I'd say we must have one of every JTAG tool. But
you try them all.
Well, you'd have to, right? Yeah.
Use the right tool for the right job.
Yeah.
On the right day.
Pretty wide library of them because you may.
Do you have recommendations if people want to get into it? What JTAG hardware and or software they want to use?
Yeah.
I mean, Joe Grant, you mentioned JTagulator. Joe Grant did a great job with that, right? There's a JTag Enum, which runs on an Arduino. If you don't want to buy a new piece of hardware, you can get a very similar behavior, a little more finicky than JTagulator, and run it on an Arduino, Mega or something. I mean, I think if you're working with a specific target, get the right professional, right? If you have the money to spend, you get the right professional tool set for that target.
Right.
Right. And that's commercial hardware and software that interfaces with the JTag interface on that device.
Exactly.
And those are like 10,000 roughly?
It depends.
So it hugely varies. I mean, some manufacturers will give you a kit for a couple hundred, and some are thousands. So, yeah.
Thoughts on
JTag just has so many variations, right? I mean, we use GoodFet, right?
I was just going to say, thoughts on GoodFet versus GreatFet.
Right.
Well, I'll push on Mike Osmond there. When I see GreatFet arrive on my doorstep, I'll start using it. In the meantime, we got the GoodFets out, and I mean both are good tools.
And same sort of way. I haven't purchased a GreatFet yet because I look at what's already available for me not having to go do a bunch of development effort. The draw's just not there yet.
Yeah.
I was talking with someone the other day, and we really want to be able to, have a great solution for a reasonably priced logic analyzer. And Cilia had great stuff, and now their Cilia 4 doesn't exist anymore, and you got to buy the 16, and it's like $800.
It's great hardware there.
It's a fantastic hardware, stuff, but some folks that are like trying to learn might not want to spend $800 on this tool that could be really helpful. But there was some discussion about some development effort for the GreatFet to be that logic analyzer.
That could solve that,
Yeah.
But somebody's got to develop it.
Yeah.
It's not there yet.
No, there's a good chipset base for that. And I mean, I think you bring up a good point, right? How do people get started in this space, right? And like one of the things we want to do is give back and like support. We all do, right? Want to give back and get the community, like get people who may be really good at security research or security engineers on one piece of software or something. Like, how do we get into hardware, right? So we just started, one of the people on our team, but did the first blog post doing like, how do you get into UART hacking? Like a really simple walkthrough, picked an inexpensive device you can buy off of Amazon, follow along with inexpensive hardware to hack in a very step-by-step. Like, so if anyone's out there interested, check it out on the blog, and we'll be posting more to get to JTag actually in a few few episodes. Awesome. To your point, I think I forget exactly, but going to cover SPI, UART, JTag, just the basic
all
protocol,
the serial protocols, and get to
Yep.
firmware and embedded web applications and things like that. Yep.
Yeah. So hopefully that'll be a useful resource, and one of the things specifically is we're trying to pick hardware that is inexpensive and widely available for people to start working with. Not what you use on a commercial assessment, but good to get exposed and see this is not magic, right? Unless you plug in too many volts and then you get some purple smoke. But
the magic smoke.
Right? The magic smoke. Yes, the magic smoke smells funny.
Leaves a little pock mark in your chip too.
So
only if you're doing it right.
Yes. Yeah.
I just have 5 questions for the each of you. They are, in fact, the Security Weekly 5 questions. You're not getting off on this. We're going to ask
I got a meme for that.
The 5 questions. So I will ask each question and then go to Jeff and Ryan to answer, and then go to the next question. It'll flow. It'll be all right. So are you ready to play 5 questions with Security Weekly?
Guess we are.
Ready as I'll ever be.
Jeff, you first. 3 words to describe yourself.
Logical. My team would probably call me anal.
Yeah.
And
I love how Ryan said it even before Jeff did.
Had to jump on it. Couldn't let him get away with it.
Logical,
but
anal, and a little bit goofy. I'll go with those 3.
Definitely.
So Ryan, 3 words to describe yourself.
I don't know.
That's one.
I like. Oof. Yeah. My team might say that. I like managing unusual situations. Right. Jumping into something that's
It's a
out
lot
of
of
control.
words. That's not one word.
Okay. Well. There we go. They'd also
I
say
see where you
talk
get
a
the
lot.
anal piece.
Yeah. There we go. I don't know. What else, Jeff?
Very thorough. You are thorough. You hold me to that.
I don't know.
That was a lot of words. We'll
Yeah,
go.
a lot of
Go.
words,
Yeah,
yeah.
it's more
So,
than
so to
three.
interrupt, Paul, my
Yeah.
meme for that was describe yourself in 3 words. Lazy.
That's a good one.
There you go.
So now we'll start with Ryan. If you were a serial killer, what would be your weapon of choice?
Well, first of all, I wouldn't do that. Second of all, probably a soldering iron.
Jeff, serial killer weapon of choice.
Backdoor blue smoke, probably sending 120 volts through something that's not supposed to have 120 volts.
Bastard operator from hell, I see.
And actually, Jeff's joking, but he did that. And, we won't say to what on
Yeah.
air.
Lots of smoke.
Because the warranty did cover it.
Warranty, hey, it stopped working. I don't know
But,
why.
You managed to get that sticker back on
Yeah.
without.
120 volts to 30 gauge wire. Good thing is there was no water damage, so warranty still covers it.
So, Jeff, if you wrote a book about yourself, what would the title be?
Book. My wife always calls what I do wires and black screen, so I think that would be a good.
That's good.
Doesn't she say like take apart?
Take apart.
Yeah,
wires
she says
and black
sometimes she
screen.
does take apart and then wires and black screen.
I love it.
Black screen's his terminal
Yeah.
up, I think, right?
Yeah.
Is that? Yeah.
Or that's what happens when you run 110 volts through.
Yeah.
Also true.
Yeah.
Ryan, if you wrote a book about yourself, what would the title be?
I don't know. I jokingly was saying the other day to somebody like hashtag fix the bits because I have no social media acumen at all, so I had to put a hashtag in front of something and
There you
fix the bits maybe.
Ryan, in the popular game of Ask Grabby Grabby, do you prefer to go first or second?
I'm gonna go second on this one. That way I wasn't the instigator. And Jeff would obviously. go first.
I guess by default I have to go first, but I'm
There you
not quite sure the implications of
That's
that.
if you're playing
It's-
together, but you can work that out later.
Let me just
Oh.
go first.
So, Jeff, choose 2 celebrities to be your parents.
Alive, dead, fictional, or otherwise.
Live dead fiction.
Oh, fix
I feel like Steve Wozniak. He's really techie but kind of lovable.
He is lovable. That's a
Yeah.
great description. Techie but lovable.
I feel like Michelle Obama would be a really good
Oh.
influence as a mom. I don't know how they would do together.
Be
But-
interesting.
Both kind of lovable, smart figures.
All right.
Ryan, 2 celebrities to be your parents.
It's a good question.
It is.
I don't know.
There are no right or wrong
yeah,
answers.
yeah.
And on air, we don't judge you.
Afterwards,
I'll be judging him later. It's fine.
exactly. The
It's
whole
fine.
team will judge us. I don't know. Conan O'Brien is funny, a lot funnier than I'll ever be. And,
Went to our college.
It's, fake went to our
Oh,
college
right,
and his
fake
fake
went too.
persona,
That's right, right,
And
yeah.
I love the gaseous wiener on
And-
Conan O'Brien. That's
I've
like
heard that about
a
you.
throwback.
he spoke at our. I think he spoke at my graduation, made fun of us all a lot. So I'll take him. And I don't know, somebody else, somebody who's been. Somebody like Marissa Meyer, hugely successful in tech, led a lot of it, and way more serious than Conan. So maybe they can work that
It's
out.
good
or something.
balance.
Good
It's a
balance.
yin and
I
a
don't
yang.
know. Yeah, I'd have to really think about that though. But
No, you shouldn't think about it.
Just
You
go with it.
Just
You
go
just-
with it. This is like a psychological evaluation of all of our guests, basically.
and somebody's gonna be looking at all of these 635 episodes and
Right.
judging us all.
That's
on
it.
those
And
questions
the
at some
sad part
point.
is, like, these were very well thought out answers. Usually it's like, who has the big boobs that you want to be your mom? Like, Angelina Jolie is, I think, the single most popular answer.
I think
Not sure
I
that's a
think
good
it's from
answer.
Hacker,
That's-
but I think it's from the movie Hackers.
But is
Ah,
it?
yeah.
really?
So based in fact. Yeah.
So this is
It was on
a
TV.
fictional game. There's
Yeah,
no right or
yeah,
wrong
yeah.
answers. You guys did great. Thank you so much. And you're going to stick around for the news discussion,
We'll stick around.
which would be great.
Thank you.
You
Looking forward to
can't, unfortunately, stick around for the hacker culture because that was pre-recorded, and we don't have a time machine yet. But I'm sure
we
you
plugged
guys
the
are working
USB
on
stick
right.
into your editing console on the way in, so I apologize to the production staff. But my team tells me it's almost done being edited right now. So
Awesome.
Yeah.
With that, we'll take a short break and come back with the news for this week. Stay tuned.